Good morning, everyone. My name is Chaela, and as she said, I'm a software engineer at Career Builder. I love programming in JavaScript and working on the UI. About a year ago, I started working in RXJS, and I felt very confused when I started learning it. I had worked in promises and used Ajax to handle asynchronous data before, but I had never used observables. There were so many terms, and I had never done reactive programming, so I saw these compared to promises often. And so I decided to think of observables as promises, and that got me pretty far. I was usually using observables from the HTTP module in Angular, and so my observables did behave a lot like promises. As my application became more complex, so did my use of observables. I needed to change my mental model on how I thought about RxJS. So today, I'm going to go back to the basics and talk about some of the core concepts of RxJS. So let's get started. So what is RxJS? It's a JavaScript library for reactive programming. So you'll often see it used for asynchronous data, like UI events or HTTP requests, but you can also use it for synchronous data. And it just comes with things out of the box, so it makes it easier for you to use observables. RxJS is built upon this concept of an observable and an observer. An observable is a set of data that you're going to have over the course of your application, and the observer wants to listen to this observable and react to it when it receives new notifications. Let's talk more about what the observable is. As I said, it's a set of data over a period of time, but it's not actually the data itself. Here, I'm creating an observable in RxJS, and I'm passing in the value hello, and that's what it will emit. It's not actually the string hello, but it's the wrapper around that data. So I like to think of an observable as a notification emitter. So if we were to execute this code, nothing would happen. And that's because there's nothing watching it. We haven't subscribed to it. Subscribe is how we connect an observer to an observable. Subscribe is so important because without it, our observable won't really do anything. So I would like to think of an observable as a function. When you have a function, you need to call it to execute it. So by calling subscribe, we execute our function, which is our observable. Subscribe will accept 3 parameters. They're not required, but they're very important. And these parameters are the observer's callbacks. And those are how we react to the observable. So to go into more detail about the observer, it's what's listening to the observable. And it's set up when we subscribe. But the observer is really just a set of callbacks. These callbacks can react to the data that we receive from the observable. So we can have multiple observers on one observable and write custom logic in each of these callbacks. And so each observer can react to that one observable in its own unique way. This gives us a lot of power as developers. So as I mentioned, there are 3 callbacks in the observer, and that's because there are 3 types of notification an observable can send. So we're going to see some examples of this and see how their behavior differs. So the first and the most important is next. Next can be called 0 to infinity times, and that's how we continue to pass new data to our observers. So in this example, we're creating a simple observable, and we're going to pass the string hello. If we wanted to see this, we would need to set up an observer. So we're going to subscribe to it. When we subscribe, we pass in a callback as our first value. And this callback is always for handling the data out of next. So in this example, we're just going to keep it simple, and we're just going to print out the value. When we execute this code, it would print out what we would expect. We would see the value hello. Another way of emitting notifications is using the error method. And as the name implies, it's for notifying our observer that an exception has occurred. So we're going to have a similar example of an observable. We're going to pass some data using next, And then we're going to call the error method and pass in a string. In order to see this value, we need to pass in the first callback to handle next. The second callback is always for handling errors. So we're going to print out both values. And when we execute this, we'll see, as we expect, hello, and then an error. Error is a little bit different than next, though, because once we call it, our observable won't continue to emit new data. And if we tried, we'd never see this. So for example, if we tried to pass in new data using next, and we executed this, our output would remain the same. Your observable is closed at that point, so don't expect new data. This has definitely tripped me up in the past. Complete is the final way that we can emit notifications. And it doesn't accept any parameters, so it's really used just for notifying that our observable isn't going to emit any more data, and we might want to react in a certain way for that instance. So we're going to call complete, and of course it doesn't accept any values. In order to see a notification from complete, we'd have to pass it in as a third callback. The third callback is always for handling those notifications. And since it doesn't accept any parameters, we're just going to print out the string completed. When we execute this, it runs as we expect, and we'd see hello and completed. Like error, if we tried to pass in more data, we'd never even see that. So it's important to remember that once your observable is complete, you're not going to see any more data emitted out of it. Okay, so now I want to talk about hot and cold observables. And I never really thought this was very important until I started having multiple subscribers on an observable, and things weren't reacting the way I expected them to. So far, I've been showing you these examples of observables, and they have all been cold observables. And that's because the data is created inside of the observable. If we added multiple subscribers onto that one observable, each one of them would see the value hello. It's very predictable. So even if you subscribed at a later time, they would all receive the same notifications. Hot observables are not as predictable, and that's because the data is produced outside of the observable. So I like to think of mouse clicks as a good example of a hot observable. We can subscribe to a mouse click, and we'll only receive a notification from that mouse click from the moment that we subscribe. We won't receive the full history of data that that observable has emitted. This is important to remember because if we have multiple subscribers on one observable and they're subscribing at different times, they're not necessarily going to receive all the same values. And this can definitely throw off your expectations if you are expecting more of a behavior like a cold observable. Now I would like to talk about operators. And this is really the fun part of RXJS. It gives you a lot of power as a developer, and it allows you to filter and transform the data coming out of an observable. So we can chain these operators together and really only receive the values that we want in the format that we need. So when we use a filtering operator, what it does is prevent data from getting to the subscribe method. When we transform, it just alters the data that we do receive. These operators are not actually changing the data inside of the observable, but it's changing what each subscription ends up seeing. So you can have multiple subscribers, use different operators, but they're all receiving the same data. So filter is a very popular operator, and that's because it's so useful. It accepts a condition, and if the condition returns true, it will allow the value to pass through. If it returns false, nothing will pass through. So we're going to be looking at some marbles diagrams with this. The values at the top are what our observable ends up emitting. This value gets passed into our filter operator, it gets compared to our condition, and if it returns true, it comes out the other side. So here we can see only the value A will actually make it through our operator. Skip a while is another useful operator, and I really love using this in my applications because I like to use it when I'm waiting for a certain set of data to instantiate. It works like filter because it accepts a condition, but once that condition becomes false, it will no longer prevent any values from, no longer filter any of the values. So we're going to have a simple condition. And as we can see, the first couple of values, the condition is true, so it's going to not allow them through. Once the condition becomes false, it no longer filters any items. So even though we have the value 1 moving through later on, and technically that's less than 3, it doesn't matter. The floodgates are open, it's no longer filtering. Debounce time is another great filter operator, and you'll frequently see it used for type aheads. What it does is it accepts a value in milliseconds. If your observable ends up emitting a lot of values within that short period of time, it'll only give you the latest value from that. So it is a form of filtering. We're going to imagine that we have a user entering hello into an input. We will receive only a few emissions from that when it goes through debounce time, but we'll still end up receiving the full word hello. It's great for type aheads, and I also like to use it for things like autosave when a user is making a lot of changes on a form, but I don't want to make a request for each action. So you can still get great performance and limit the number of requests you make. Map is a very powerful transforming operator. You can pretty much pass in whatever kind of logic that you want into it, and whatever is returned from the map operator is what moves forward and what your subscribe block will end up seeing. So for this, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to multiply the value by 2. When our observable ends up emitting the values, they come out immediately after going through the operator, and they are now multiples of 2. But you can create whatever kind of logic you need to suit your certain scenario. Another way of transforming items is using the pluck operator. I really like to use this when I'm working with objects, especially when I'm using observables for state management. And what it does is it accepts properties in a string, and it will return the value of that property. In this example, we're going to pass in an object, and this object has the user property, and it has a nested property called name. So we'll pass in the string user and then name, and all we'll end up ever seeing is the value of that property, which is Tom. So it kind of simplifies typing out what you need on properties. The final operator that I'm going to talk about is for error handling. If you've ever used promises, it works very similar to the catch on a promise. And what catch does is it intercepts an error before it makes it to your error callback in your subscribe method. So we can handle this in many different ways. We could decide to throw a new observable with a specific error message that we need, or we could just return a new observable and pretend like the error never happened. In this example, we're just going to return a new observable and pretend it didn't happen. So our observable emits the values 1, 2, an error happens, and before hitting subscribe, it comes to our catch operator. We decide we want to return the new observable with the values 3, 4. And an observable is now going to emit the values 3, 4. So there's a lot of different types of logic that you could put in here, but it's great if you want to add retry logic or any other thing. Finally, I want to talk about best practices. When you are using observables, it's easy to forget to unsubscribe from them. But if you leave them hanging around, this is going to cause memory leaks in your application. Most of us are using Angular applications, and these applications will get very big. So the last thing you want to do is have to chase down where a memory leak is coming from. It's better to get in the habit of unsubscribing and just working off a best practice. So we're going to talk about a few ways that you can unsubscribe. So the first is the most straightforward. we call unsubscribe on our subscription. I like to do this in the ngDestroy lifecycle hook on my component. It's an easy way for me to know that I've cleaned up after myself. Another way to close down is to use an operator. And in particular, I like to use take. But what these operators do is they take a certain number of values that your observable emits. For example, if we were to pass in the value 3 to take, it would take 3 emissions and then automatically close down the subscription. You don't have to worry about the cleanup or calling unsubscribe. And if I know that I'm only needing a couple of values, I like to use one of these operators. The final way, if you're using Angular, is to use the async pipe. And what this does is it closes down your subscription when your component gets destroyed. So it's another easy way to know that you've cleaned up after yourself. But just remember to get in the habit of unsubscribing or using one of these methods for closing down that subscription. So I've just scratched the surface of all there is in RxJS, and there's so much more to learn. But RxJS documentation has a lot of great resources. If you are looking for examples of how to use operators and just need some quick reference, I highly recommend looking at learnrxjs.io. They have examples on how to use operators, how to create observables, and it's really easy to digest. Finally, I know there are a lot of advanced RxJS users out here, and so you probably are looking for something more in depth. And so Ben Lesh has some great articles on Medium where he goes into more depth about the observer and the observable pattern and subjects. So if you need some more information, I really recommend reading his articles. But that's all I've prepared today. I hope that you all feel more comfortable using RxJS in your applications. Thank you.